The word Crusades makes it sound like a single war. It was not. It was nearly 200 years of campaigns, truces, betrayals, and shifting alliances launched by different popes, led by kings and criminals in roughly equal measure, and fought as often between Christian factions as between Christians and Muslims. Some of the men who marched east under the cross spent more time fighting fellow Crusaders or looting fellow Christians than they ever spent fighting the armies they claimed to have come to defeat. One of the largest Crusader armies ever assembled never reached the Holy Land at all. It sacked a Christian city instead and changed the course of an empire that had stood for nearly 900 years. If that surprises you, you are already closer to the real story than most popular retellings get. So dim the light near you if there is one to dim, and let yourself settle in for a long, unhurried account. What follows is not a story of simple good against simple evil, whichever side you might expect to root for. It is the story of shifting frontiers, uneasy kingdoms built by foreigners in someone else's land, a sultan remembered for mercy he did not have to show, a king remembered as much for legend as for what he actually accomplished, and an ending that came not with a single dramatic battle but with the slow, grinding loss of everything the first Crusaders had fought to build. If you find value in this kind of patient unfolding of a genuinely complicated history, there is a subscribe button somewhere near this video, worth using only if it actually adds something to your evenings. It begins, as so many long and consequential wars do, with an appeal for help that traveled much further than anyone who made it ever intended. To understand why tens of thousands of people left their homes in Western Europe to march toward a city most of them had never seen, you first need to understand the world as it stood in the final decades of the 11th century, a world already in motion long before any pope said a word. In 1071, a Byzantine army under Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes was decisively defeated by Seljuk Turkish forces under Sultan Alp Arslan at the Battle of Manzikert, in eastern Anatolia. The defeat itself was serious enough, but the civil war and political chaos that followed inside the Byzantine Empire proved far more costly than the battle had been. Within a decade, Byzantine authority over most of Anatolia, the empire's traditional heartland and its most reliable source of soldiers and tax revenue, had effectively collapsed, replaced by a patchwork of Seljuk-ruled territories collectively remembered as the Sultanate of Rum. By the time a capable new emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, took the Byzantine throne in 1081, the empire he inherited controlled only a fraction of the territory it had held a generation earlier, and faced pressure from multiple directions at once: Seljuk Turks in the east, Norman adventurers pressing into Byzantine territory in the west, and a treasury strained by decades of instability. The Manzikert campaign itself is worth a moment's closer attention, since the battle's actual outcome was, by most modern historical assessments, considerably less catastrophic in strictly military terms than its long-term consequences would suggest. Romanos IV's army was substantial, and the defeat, while real, was not an annihilation on the scale of some later medieval disasters. What actually converted a serious but survivable battlefield loss into a genuine imperial collapse was the political crisis that followed almost immediately. Romanos was captured by Alp Arslan, treated with recorded courtesy and released under a negotiated peace, only to return home and find himself overthrown in a court coup by rivals who repudiated the peace terms he had agreed to, plunging the empire into a debilitating civil war precisely when it could least afford one, and leaving Anatolia's frontier defenses to collapse from sheer administrative neglect rather than from any single further Seljuk military triumph. Sultan Alp Arslan and the broader Seljuk dynasty he led were themselves relatively recent arrivals to the region, a Turkic Muslim dynasty that had migrated from Central Asia and, over the preceding decades, built a sprawling empire stretching from Central Asia through Persia and into the heart of the Middle East, nominally subordinate to the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad but functioning, in practice, as the dominant military and political power across most of the Sunni Islamic world by the time. Its forces met Romanos IV's army at Manzikert. Western Europe, meanwhile, was hardly a picture of unity or peace in this same period. The papacy itself had spent much of the 11th century locked in a bitter struggle with the Holy Roman Empire over the authority to appoint bishops, a conflict historians call the investiture controversy, which had left the reform-minded papacy searching for ways to assert moral and political leadership over a fractious European nobility that spent much of its energy fighting itself. Western Christendom also had a long, well-established tradition of pilgrimage to Jerusalem, a journey that had generally remained possible, if difficult, under the various Muslim dynasties that had controlled the city since the 7th century, including the Fatimid Caliphate, which held Jerusalem for most of the 11th century and had generally permitted Christian pilgrimage and maintained Christian holy sites, though conditions varied considerably depending on the ruler and the period, and were not, contrary to some later Crusader-era propaganda, uniformly or continuously hostile to Christian visitors. One further feature of Western European society in this period deserves mention, since it helps explain why Urban's eventual appeal found such an enormous and enthusiastic audience among the knightly class specifically. Throughout the 10th and 11th centuries, the Western Church had promoted a set of related initiatives generally known as the Peace of God and the Truce of God, aimed at limiting the near-constant low-level warfare that European nobility waged against one another and against unarmed populations by declaring certain days, seasons, and categories of people, clergy, peasants, merchants, formally off-limits to violence under threat of excommunication. These movements had achieved only partial and inconsistent success at actually restraining Europe's endemic aristocratic violence, but they reflected a genuine and long-standing clerical anxiety about how to direct the energy, ambition, and simple appetite for combat of an entire hereditary warrior class toward something the Church could regard as spiritually productive rather than merely destructive. An anxiety Urban's eventual call to arms would answer in a way no earlier peace initiative ever had, by offering Western Christendom's knights a war the Church could bless rather than merely restrain. It was into this landscape, a weakened Byzantium anxious about its eastern frontier, a Western Christendom reorganizing itself around a newly assertive papacy, and a long tradition of pilgrimage that made Jerusalem a place many ordinary Christians already thought about with real longing, that a request for help arrived from Constantinople and found, in the hands of one particular pope, far more receptive an audience than its sender likely ever anticipated. Emperor Alexios I, seeking military assistance to help recover Byzantine territory lost to the Seljuks, sent envoys to Pope Urban II in the spring of 1095, requesting mercenary soldiers to bolster his own forces, a fairly conventional diplomatic request, of the kind Byzantine emperors had made to Western powers before, and one that envisioned, as far as the surviving evidence suggests, a modest reinforcement rather than what actually followed. Urban II, however, saw in this request an opportunity considerably larger than Alexios had likely intended. In November of 1095, at a church council held in Clermont, in what is now central France, Urban II delivered a sermon calling on Western Christians to take up arms and march east, not merely to assist Byzantium, but to liberate Jerusalem itself from Muslim rule. No verbatim transcript of the sermon survives. The accounts that do survive were written down years afterward, by chroniclers who had their own reasons to shape the Pope's words into something more stirring and more providential in hindsight than whatever Urban actually said that day. What these later accounts agree on, broadly, is the emotional core of the appeal, a call to defend fellow Christians in the East, a promise of spiritual reward, specifically, the remission of the temporal punishment due for sins, a doctrine that would later be refined and formalized as the indulgence for those who undertook the journey with the right intentions, and a vivid appeal to reclaim the city where Christ had died, which Urban's sermon reportedly described in the kind of devastated, defiled condition unlikely to have accurately reflected Jerusalem's actual state under the generally tolerant governance of the Fatimid Caliphate at that time. The specific spiritual promise Urban offered deserves a slightly more careful explanation than forgiveness of sins, the loose shorthand later popular retellings often reach for. Medieval Catholic theology held that even a sin genuinely forgiven through confession still carried a temporal debt of punishment, to be paid either through penance in life or suffering in purgatory after death. What Urban offered participants in the Jerusalem campaign was a plenary indulgence, canceling this entire remaining temporal debt in exchange for undertaking the armed pilgrimage with sincere religious intent, rather than a blanket absolution that excused participants from the moral consequences of whatever they did along the way, a distinction some Crusaders' subsequent conduct suggests they either did not fully grasp or chose not to dwell on. This formal indulgence, refined and expanded by successive popes across the following century into an increasingly standardized and, in later centuries, increasingly commercialized system, would become one of the crusading movement's most consequential and controversial long-term legacies for the Western Church itself, its later abuses eventually numbering among the specific grievances Martin Luther would raise against the Catholic Church at the opening of the Protestant Reformation, more than. For centuries after Urban first offered the promise at Clermont, the response to Urban's call, by every surviving account, exceeded anything he or Alexios could have anticipated. Crowds at Clermont reportedly interrupted the sermon with cries of Deus Vult, God wills it, a phrase that would become the movement's rallying cry, and within months, preachers across France, Germany, and Italy were spreading the call far beyond the audience of knights and nobles Urban had originally addressed it to. Those who formally committed to the campaign marked their vow with a distinctive ritual that gave the entire movement its enduring name, a cloth cross sewn onto the shoulder of a participant's clothing, symbolizing that the wearer had taken the cross. The Latin term for this act, crus signatus, signed with the cross, is the direct linguistic ancestor of the word crusade itself, though that specific English word would not actually come into common use until centuries later, well after the movement it now describes had already ended. Participants also understood themselves to be undertaking an armed pilgrimage rather than simply a war, entitled to the same legal protections, including the freezing of debts and legal proceedings back home for the duration of the journey, that the Church had long extended to conventional unarmed pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem or other holy sites, a legal framework that made taking the cross attractive for reasons considerably more practical than religious zeal alone. What began as a request for a few thousand mercenary soldiers to help a beleaguered Byzantine emperor had, within less than a year, become something closer to a mass movement, drawing not only the armored knights and professional soldiers the campaign genuinely needed, but tens of thousands of ordinary people with no military training at all, many of them driven by the same spiritual promises Urban had offered, and by economic desperation, religious enthusiasm, and social pressures particular. To their own communities that had very little to do with the strategic situation in Anatolia that had prompted Alexios's original request in the first place. Among the first to respond to Urban's call was not a nobleman at all, but a charismatic itinerant preacher known as Peter the Hermit, whose fiery sermons across France and the Rhineland drew enormous crowds of common people, peasants, minor clergy, the urban poor, eager to join what they understood as a holy pilgrimage with a military purpose, months before the organized noble armies Urban had actually envisioned were ready to march. This loosely organized mass movement, which modern historians generally call the People's Crusade, set out in the spring of 1096, months ahead of the main Crusader armies, poorly equipped, poorly supplied, and almost entirely lacking the military discipline or leadership that any serious campaign against a professional army would require. Before this undisciplined mass of pilgrims and would-be soldiers had even left Western Europe, a genuinely dark chapter unfolded that deserves direct, unflinching treatment rather than the brief mention it sometimes receives in more celebratory retellings. As bands of crusaders and local mobs moved through the Rhineland in the spring and early summer of 1096, several of them, in cities including Worms, Mainz, and Cologne, turned violently against local Jewish communities, and a series of massacres modern historians refer to collectively as the Rhineland massacres. The reasoning behind these attacks, as recorded in both Christian and Hebrew chronicles from the period, drew on a distorted logic that framed local Jewish communities as a more immediate and available target for a movement whose original stated purpose was to fight distant Muslim powers, a piece of reasoning that had no basis in the actual campaign's stated goals or in any instruction from Urban II or the organized Crusades' noble leadership, several of whom, including Emperor Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire, actively condemned the violence and, in some cases, tried genuinely and at real personal risk to shelter targeted Jewish communities. Hebrew chronicles from the period, most notably the account traditionally associated with a rabbi named Solomon Bar Simpson, describe entire communities choosing mass suicide rather than forced conversion or slaughter at the hands of the mobs, a testimony of extraordinary anguish that historians treat as a broadly reliable, if understandably grief-stricken, record of events that Christian chroniclers of the period largely passed over in near silence. Modern historians estimate the death toll of the Rhineland massacres in the thousands, making this one of the most severe instances of anti-Jewish violence in medieval European history up to that point, and one that set a grim precedent invoked, directly or indirectly, in later waves of anti-Jewish violence associated with subsequent crusades, including further, smaller outbreaks of violence against Jewish communities that recurred in parts of France and England during the preaching of the Second and Third Crusades decades later, a pattern later Jewish liturgical and historical memory would come to treat as a recurring, structurally linked feature of the broader crusading period rather than a series of isolated, unconnected incidents. The People's Crusade itself, having finally reached Byzantine territory, fared little better against the military threat it had actually set out to confront. Emperor Alexios, alarmed by the size and indiscipline of this civilian-heavy force arriving well ahead of the organized noble armies he had actually requested, ferried them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia as quickly as he reasonably could, eager to move the unpredictable mass away from his own capital. There, in October of 1096, a large portion of this poorly led group was ambushed and effectively destroyed by Seljuk forces near Nicaea, a catastrophic, near total defeat that ended the People's Crusade as an organized force, though it did not end the broader movement Urban had set in motion, since the actual armies of the nobility, better equipped, better led, and considerably more formidable, were only just beginning their own march east. The organized noble armies that Urban II's call had actually been aimed at began arriving in Byzantine territory in late 1096 and early 1097, traveling by several separate overland and sea routes under a collection of powerful Western European lords rather than any single unified command, a structural weakness that would trouble the entire crusading movement for the whole of its two-century existence. It is worth pausing here, too, on a question of scale that later chroniclers on all sides tended to inflate considerably. Medieval sources describing the First Crusade's total numbers, whether Christian or Muslim in origin, frequently cite figures in the hundreds of thousands, totals modern historians regard as substantially exaggerated in the same rhetorical tradition that inflated battlefield casualty counts throughout the medieval period. Careful modern estimates, based on logistical analysis of what the roads, ports, and supply lines of the period could plausibly have supported, generally place the combined fighting strength of the First Crusade's various armies somewhere in the range of 30,000 to 60,000 at their combined peak, a figure still substantial for the period but considerably more modest than the vast hosts described in the more rhetorically inclined chronicles. Among the most prominent of these leaders were Godfrey of Bouillon, a duke from Lower Lorraine, Raymond of St. Gilles, the Count of Toulouse, and one of the wealthiest and most senior nobles to take the cross, Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman lord from southern Italy whose family had a long and often hostile history with the Byzantine Empire itself, and Bohemond's nephew Tancred, along with several other regional lords each commanding their own retinues. Emperor Alexios, faced now with the arrival of the actual military force he had originally requested, though on a scale and with an independence of purpose considerably beyond what he had likely anticipated, worked to extract oaths of loyalty from each of the Crusader leaders as they passed through Constantinople, requiring them to swear to return to Byzantine control any formerly Byzantine territory the Crusade managed to recapture from the Seljuks. This arrangement, uneasy from the start and complicated by deep cultural and religious differences between the Latin Christian West and Greek Christian Byzantium, differences that had grown wider still following the formal schism between the Roman and Constantinopolitan churches in 1054, would fracture repeatedly over the following years, as individual Crusader leaders, Bohemond most notoriously among them, found reasons to treat their oaths as considerably more flexible than Alexios had intended. The first major military test came at Nicaea in the spring of 1097, where the combined Crusader army, working in coordination with Byzantine forces for what would prove to be one of the few genuinely cooperative moments of the entire campaign, besieged and captured the Seljuk-held city. True to the letter, if not entirely the spirit, of the earlier oaths, Nicaea was returned to Byzantine control rather than looted or kept by the Crusaders themselves, an outcome that satisfied Alexios but reportedly left a number of the Crusader rank and file, who had expected to share in whatever plunder the city offered, considerably less pleased with how their first real victory of the campaign had actually been resolved. From Nicaea, the Crusader army pressed on across Anatolia in two separate divisions, a division of march order that nearly proved disastrous at Dorylaeum in July of 1097, when Seljuk forces under Kilij Arslan caught the vanguard division, traveling somewhat ahead of and separated from the main body of the army. In a punishing running battle of mounted archery, the Crusaders' heavier, less mobile cavalry struggled badly to counter in the battle's early hours. The vanguard held its ground through a desperate, costly morning of fighting, sending urgent word back to the trailing division, and the battle was ultimately won only when the Second Crusader force arrived in time to strike the Seljuk army from an unexpected direction, catching Kilij Arslan's forces between two Crusader divisions at once. Doralium taught the Crusader leadership a lasting lesson about Seljuk mounted archery tactics and the real danger of allowing the army's various contingents to become separated on the march, shaping a more cautious approach to the grueling overland journey still ahead, through increasingly barren terrain and increasingly desperate supply conditions, toward the great fortified city that would become the campaign's first truly severe test, Antioch. Antioch, one of the great cities of the ancient and early Christian world, sat astride the Crusaders' route into Syria, and its capture was, by any reasonable strategic assessment, essential to the campaign's continued success. A heavily fortified city with walls stretching for miles, studded with towers, and defended by a garrison under the Seljuk governor Yagisayan that had every reason to expect the massive defensive advantage the city's fortifications should have provided. The Crusader siege of Antioch, beginning in October of 1097, dragged on for more than 7 agonizing months through a winter of severe supply shortages, disease, and desertion that thinned Crusader ranks considerably before the city itself was ever actually taken. The siege was finally broken not through direct assault but through betrayal from within. In June of 1098, an Armenian officer within the city's garrison, reportedly named Pyrrhus, secretly agreed to open a postern gate to Bohemians' forces in exchange for reward and, according to some accounts, personal grievance against the city's governor. Crusader forces poured into the city under cover of darkness, and after brutal, chaotic street fighting, Antioch fell, though the Crusaders' triumph proved short-lived and almost immediately precarious, since a large relief army under the Mosul-based warlord Kerboga arrived at the city's gates only days later, effectively trapping the exhausted, disease-weakened Crusader forces inside the very walls they had just captured, now besieged in turn by a numerically superior force of their own. Even before Kerboga's relief army arrived, the Crusader occupation of the newly captured city had already come at a severe human cost that deserves to be stated plainly. The initial capture of Antioch was followed by a further massacre of a significant portion of the city's own population, including local Christians caught up in the chaotic night assault alongside the Muslim garrison, a detail contemporary Crusader chroniclers record with considerably less discomfort than modern readers might expect, treating indiscriminate violence in a captured city as an unremarkable and unavoidable feature of siege warfare rather than something requiring explanation or justification. It was in this desperate context, with morale collapsing and starvation setting in, that one of the Crusades' most debated and mythologized episodes unfolded. A visionary pilgrim named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received a series of divine revelations indicating the location, buried beneath the floor of Antioch's Cathedral, of the Holy Lance, the spear reportedly used to pierce the side of the crucified Christ. An object matching this description was indeed excavated during a dig that Peter Bartholomew himself participated in and helped direct, and its discovery, whatever one makes of its authenticity, a question that divided even contemporary Crusader leaders at the time, several of whom expressed open skepticism, and that modern historians treat with considerable additional doubt given the circumstances of its convenient discovery, produced a genuine and significant surge in Crusader morale at the precise moment it was most desperately needed. Reinvigorated, the Crusader army sallied out from Antioch's walls on the 28th of June, 1098, and, in a battle whose outcome surprised observers on both sides, decisively routed Kerboga's considerably larger relief force, securing Antioch for the Crusaders and clearing the path toward the campaign's ultimate objective, still more than a year of hard marching away. Following the victory at Antioch, the Crusader leadership spent months mired in internal disputes over the sea's political control, disputes that delayed the march toward Jerusalem considerably and that, in Bohemon's case, ended with him simply keeping Antioch for himself as an independent principality rather than returning it to Byzantine control as his earlier oath to Alexios had specified. A breach that permanently soured relations between the Crusader states and Constantinople for essentially the remainder of their shared history. It was not until the following year, in the spring and early summer of 1099, that the diminished but still formidable core of the Crusader army, a fraction of the force that had originally set out from Europe, thinned by years of combat, disease, starvation, and simple attrition, finally resumed its march toward Jerusalem itself. Modern historians estimate that of the perhaps 30 to 60,000 fighters who had set out from Europe or joined the campaign along the way, no more than roughly 12 to 15,000 combatants, along with a comparable number of non-combatant pilgrims, servants, and camp followers, actually remained with the army by the time it finally came within sight of the city it had spent nearly 3 years marching toward, a sobering illustration of just how much of the First Crusades' original strength had simply been consumed by the journey itself before a single soldier ever laid eyes on Jerusalem's walls. The march south passed through one episode this account will not pass over quietly, however uncomfortable it is to include. During a lengthy siege of the town of Mara al-Numan in December of 1098, a severe famine gripped the Crusader camp and several contemporary Christian chroniclers, including Radulf of Caen and the anonymous author of the Gesta Francorum, record, in matter-of-fact rather than horrified terms, that starving Crusader soldiers resorted to eating the flesh of dead Muslim opponents. Modern historians generally accept these accounts as substantially reliable rather than hostile invention, precisely because they come from Crusader sources describing their own side's conduct rather than from any opposing chronicler with an obvious motive to fabricate the detail. The episode, alongside the broader famine and disease that stalked the Crusader army for much of its journey through Syria, is a reminder that the suffering of this campaign was not confined to any single side of the conflict, and that ordinary Crusader soldiers experienced privation as severe, in its own way, as anything inflicted on the populations they besieged. The city, by this point, had recently changed hands. The Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt had retaken Jerusalem from the Seljuks only the year before, in 1098, meaning the garrison the Crusaders eventually faced was Fatimid rather than Seljuk, a detail that complicates any simple narrative of the campaign as a single continuous conflict against one unified Muslim power. The Crusader siege of Jerusalem, beginning in early June of 1099, proceeded with an urgency driven partly by dwindling supplies and partly by the knowledge that a Fatimid relief force was likely already being assembled in Egypt. After weeks of siege preparation, including the construction of substantial siege towers from timber that had to be gathered and hauled from considerable distances given Jerusalem's arid surroundings, Crusader forces breached the city's walls on the 15th of July, 1099. What followed is one of the most difficult episodes in this entire account to render honestly, and this account will not soften it. Contemporary Christian chronicles, including the Gesta Francorum and letters written by Crusader participants themselves, describe extensive slaughter of the city's population following the breach. Combatants and, by multiple contemporary accounts, substantial numbers of non-combatants alike, both Muslim and Jewish residents of the city, killed over the following 1 to 2 days of largely uncontrolled violence inside Jerusalem's walls. The precise casualty figures given in the most vivid contemporary accounts. Some medieval chronicles describe blood running through the streets in quantities modern historians regard as rhetorically exaggerated rather than literally accurate. A common feature of medieval battle narrative meant to convey totality and divine judgment rather than precise numbers should be read with real caution, and this account will not repeat the most extreme figures as though they were reliable statistics. What is not seriously disputed, across both Christian and Muslim sources describing the aftermath, is that the violence was extensive, that it was not limited to combatants taken in the heat of the initial breach, and that many Crusader participants and chroniclers described the slaughter not with horror but with religious triumph, framing it explicitly as righteous judgment rather than atrocity, a framing that later historians, including many working within Christian historical traditions, have increasingly and directly rejected as a moral assessment while still treating the events themselves as well-documented historical fact rather than exaggeration or myth. Jerusalem, after 4 years and a journey of literally thousands of miles, had fallen to the Crusaders, and the manner of its fall would echo, in Muslim historical memory particularly, for centuries afterward, invoked repeatedly during the very Muslim reconquest campaigns this account will describe in the chapters ahead. In the aftermath of Jerusalem's capture, the Crusader leadership faced an immediate and practical question that the campaign's original religious framing had done little to prepare them for. Having taken the city, what would they actually do with it, and who would govern the considerable territory the Crusade had now conquered across the Levant? Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen to lead the new Christian state established around Jerusalem, though he reportedly declined the title of king, preferring instead the more modest style of advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, a decision his successor, his brother Baldwin, would not repeat. Baldwin, an energetic and capable ruler who would go on to expand the kingdom's borders considerably during his own reign, was crowned King of Jerusalem on Christmas Day, 1100, formally establishing what modern historians call the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the most prominent of what would become 4 separate Crusader states collectively known as the Crusader states or, in the terminology of the period, Outremer, meaning overseas. Alongside the Kingdom of Jerusalem, 3 additional Crusader territories had already taken shape during the campaign itself, each with its own separate ruling family and its own often independent, sometimes even actively conflicting, political interests. Bohemian's Principality of Antioch, established even before Jerusalem fell, remained the wealthiest and most militarily significant of the northern Crusader territories, its position astride major trade routes making it both strategically vital and a source of persistent tension with Byzantium, which never fully abandoned its claim to a city its earlier agreement with the Crusaders had promised would be returned. To the south of Antioch, the county of Tripoli was established somewhat later, founded principally through the efforts of Raymond of St. Gilles and completed, after his death, by his successors around 1109. And to the northeast, in the region around the city of Edessa, Baldwin of Bouillon, Godfrey's own brother, and the future King Baldwin I of Jerusalem, had established the county of Edessa even before the main Crusader army reached Antioch, making it, chronologically, the very first of the 4 Crusader states to be founded, and, as later chapters in this account will describe, ultimately the first to fall. Jerusalem's fall did not end the immediate military threat to the new Crusader foothold. Barely 3 weeks after the city's capture, a Fatimid relief army marching up from Egypt, considerably delayed by the same logistical distances that had constrained the Crusaders' own campaign, finally arrived near the coastal town of Ascalon and was met and decisively defeated by a Crusader force that, though heavily outnumbered by most contemporary estimates, benefited from surprise and from the same battlefield discipline that had carried the campaign through Antioch and Jerusalem alike. The Battle of Ascalon, fought on the 12th of August, 1099, secured the Crusader conquest against its most immediate and serious external threat, though the coastal town of Ascalon itself, ironically, would not actually fall under Crusader control for more than another half-century. A reminder that even a decisive Crusader battlefield victory did not always translate cleanly into full territorial control of the surrounding region. The victory at Ascalon also exposed, almost immediately, the same structural weakness in Crusader leadership that had troubled the campaign since its earliest days on Byzantine soil. Rather than pressing the advantage and seizing the town outright while its garrison was demoralized, the Crusader commanders fell into an open dispute over who would actually receive credit and control of the prize. A quarrel serious enough that Raymond of St. Gilles reportedly refused to hand the town over to Godfrey of Bullion's authority at all, allowing the opportunity to slip away and leaving Ascalon in Fatimid hands for decades to come. This pattern, genuine tactical and religious cohesion in the heat of battle, followed by fractious, self-defeating political rivalry the moment any battle actually ended, would recur across nearly every decade of Crusader history this account goes on to describe, and stands as one of the clearest through lines connecting the movement's first campaign to its last. These four territories, though sometimes loosely allied and connected by shared religious identity and mutual strategic interest, functioned as genuinely separate political entities, each ruled by its own lord, each pursuing its own regional priorities, and each, crucially, existing as a relatively thin ruling class of Western European Christian settlers governing a population that remained overwhelmingly composed of the region's existing inhabitants, Muslims, Eastern Christians of various denominations including Greek Orthodox, Syriac, and Armenian communities, and a smaller number of Jewish residents, a demographic reality that would shape, and in significant ways constrain, how the Crusader states could actually govern for the entirety of their nearly two-century existence in the region. Governing a conquered territory, it turned out, required a very different set of skills than conquering one, and the Crusader lords who now ruled over Outremer developed, over the following decades, a system of governance shaped as much by pragmatic necessity as by any transplanted European model. Crusader law, most fully codified in a later legal compilation known as the Assizes of Jerusalem, blended elements of Western European feudal custom with adaptations genuinely necessary for governing a religiously and ethnically diverse population in an unfamiliar climate and landscape. Muslim, Jewish, and Eastern Christian subjects generally continued practicing their own religions and, in many documented cases, retained access to their own local courts and legal customs for matters that did not directly concern their Crusader overlords, a pattern of practical accommodation that stood in some tension with the explicitly religious justification the Crusade itself had been launched under. Governance of the Crusader states was not, contrary to what a purely male-dominated popular image of knights and kings might suggest, an entirely male affair. Melisende, daughter of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, ruled as queen regnant in her own right for over a decade following her father's death in 1131, first alongside her husband Fulk and then, after his death, as regent for their young son, exercising genuine independent political authority, commissioning significant religious architecture and manuscripts, and successfully defending her position against at least one serious attempt by her own son to sideline her once he came of age. Melisandre's reign stands as the most prominent, but not the only, example of women exercising substantial political power within the Crusader state's formerly patriarchal feudal structure, a pattern that also included several countesses who governed Tripoli and Edessa in their own right during periods when male heirs were absent, captured, or too young to rule. This period also saw the founding of the military religious orders that would become perhaps the most distinctive and enduring institutional legacy of the entire crusading movement. The Knights Templar, formally established around 1119 by a French knight named Hugh de Payens, began as a small band dedicated to protecting Christian pilgrims traveling the dangerous roads between the coast and Jerusalem, and took its name from the group's original headquarters on the Temple Mount, on or near the site of the historical Jewish temple. The Knights Hospitaller, whose origins actually predate the First Crusade as a charitable order running a hospital for pilgrims in Jerusalem, gradually took on a substantial military role of their own over the following decades, evolving alongside the Templars into one of the two most powerful and well-resourced military institutions in the Crusader states. Both orders developed a distinctive structure combining monastic religious vows with active military service, received extensive land grants and financial donations from sympathetic nobility across Western Europe, and eventually built and garrisoned some of the most formidable fortifications in the entire region, including castles like Croix des Chevaliers, whose scale and engineering sophistication still draws the attention of military historians today. Croix des Chevaliers itself, substantially rebuilt and expanded by the Hospitallers after they acquired it in 1142, incorporated concentric double walls, a design allowing defenders to fall back to an inner fortification even if an outer wall was breached, along with vast vaulted storage chambers capable of holding provisions for a garrison to withstand a siege of many months. Refinements in military engineering that later found their way back into European castle design more broadly, as returning Crusaders and their architects applied lessons learned from Byzantine and Muslim fortification traditions encountered in the Levant to castle building projects back home. These fortresses were not merely defensive, garrisoned by relatively small numbers of highly trained knights alongside larger complements of local auxiliary troops. They also functioned as forward operating bases, allowing the military orders to project power, collect tribute, and control surrounding trade routes across a much wider territory than their modest garrison numbers alone would suggest was possible. Daily life and culture in the Crusader states, meanwhile, developed in ways considerably more complicated than the strict religious separation the Crusades' original rhetoric might suggest. Trade between Crusader territories and neighboring Muslim states continued, often robustly, even during periods of open military conflict, since merchants and rulers on both sides recognized genuine mutual economic benefit that religious hostility alone rarely overrode for long. A distinct local Crusader culture gradually emerged among the settler population, sometimes called Polanes by contemporaries, a term with a somewhat uncertain and debated etymology, incorporating local dress, cuisine, architectural styles, and in some documented cases genuine social and even marital ties with the region's existing communities. Developments that newly arrived Crusaders and pilgrims from Western Europe sometimes viewed with open suspicion regarding the increasingly acclimatized local settler nobility as having grown soft or overly accommodating toward the very populations the crusade had originally been launched to displace or convert. One of the most valuable surviving windows into this everyday coexistence comes not from a Crusader source at all but from a Muslim one, the memoir of Usama ibn Munkid, a Syrian nobleman, poet, and warrior who spent decades interacting with Crusader lords, knights, and pilgrims, and whose autobiography, written late in his long life, describes relationships with individual Franks ranging from genuine friendship and mutual respect to sharp, sometimes mocking cultural bewilderment at Frankish customs he found strange or crude by the standards of his own considerably more urbane courtly culture. Usama's memoir is treated by modern historians as an unusually candid and valuable source precisely because it resists any simple narrative of constant, unrelenting hostility between the two civilizations, describing a frontier society where alliances regularly crossed religious lines when it suited the political interests involved, and where genuine curiosity and even affection between individuals coexisted, sometimes within the very same relationships, alongside real and often violent religious and political conflict. The Syrian frontier during this same period was also home to a smaller, distinct religious and political movement that would leave an outsized mark on Crusader legend, the Nizari Ismailis, a branch of Shia Islam whose followers, organized around a network of mountain fortresses in Syria and Persia, became feared across the region for a systematic campaign of political assassination targeting rival Muslim and, on occasion, Crusader leaders alike. Western Crusader accounts, garbling the group's actual beliefs considerably, gave rise to the enduring legend of the Old Man of the Mountain and to the word assassin itself, which entered European languages during this period as a direct, if historically distorted, borrowing from the group's popular Arabic nickname. The economic life of the Crusader states depended heavily on a set of institutions and relationships not always visible in accounts focused primarily on battles and sieges. The Knights Templar, beyond their military role, developed what modern financial historians recognize as an early and genuinely sophisticated banking network, allowing pilgrims and crusaders to deposit funds at one Templar house in Europe and withdraw an equivalent sum, minus a fee, at another Templar house in the Levant, sparing travelers the very real danger of carrying large sums of cash across thousands of miles of frequently hostile territory. The Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa foremost among them, provided the shipping, financing, and ongoing supply lines that made the Crusader states' continued existence practically possible at all, and in exchange extracted substantial trading privileges and entire dedicated merchant quarters within Crusader port cities like Acre and Tyre, arrangements that made these Italian city-states significant beneficiaries of the crusading project's ongoing commercial relationships with the Levant, regardless of how any individual military campaign happened to turn out. For nearly half a century after the First Crusade's conclusion, the Crusader states existed in a state of persistent but manageable tension with their Muslim neighbors, punctuated by periodic raids, shifting alliances, and occasional larger confrontations, but without any single unified Muslim power capable of seriously threatening the Crusader territories as a whole. That changed with the rise of Imad ad-Din Zengi, the ambitious Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, who spent the 1130s and early 1140s steadily consolidating Muslim territory in northern Syria, motivated by genuine strategic ambition as much as by any specifically anti-Crusader religious agenda, since Zengi fought Muslim rivals for territory with essentially the same willingness he fought the Crusader states themselves. In December of 1144, Zengi's forces besieged and captured Edessa, the northernmost and most exposed of the four Crusader states, in a campaign whose success owed considerably to the county's isolated position and the fact that its ruler, Count Jocelyn II, was away from the city with much of his available military force at the time of the attack. The fall of Edessa, The very first Crusader state established, now the very first to be lost, sent shockwaves through Western Europe when news of it eventually arrived, and prompted Pope Eugene III to call for a new crusade to recover the lost territory, a call that found its most effective and passionate advocate not in the Pope himself but in Bernard of Clairvaux, a Cistercian abbot whose preaching tour across France and Germany proved extraordinarily successful at recruiting new crusaders, including, notably, two reigning monarchs, King Louis VII of France and, after considerable additional persuasion, the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III. The Second Crusade that followed, launched with genuinely formidable royal backing unlike anything the First Crusade had commanded, proved to be a comprehensive and, for the Crusader movement's broader morale, genuinely damaging failure. Both the German and French contingents suffered severe losses crossing Anatolia, worn down by Seljuk harassment, difficult terrain, and supply failures considerably worse than what the First Crusade's leaders had faced in the same region decades earlier. The surviving remnants of the Crusader forces that did reach the Levant, rather than attempting to recover Edessa itself, made the fateful decision, driven by local Crusader state politics and disagreements among the various leaders present rather than any coherent overall strategy, to instead besiege Damascus, a city whose ruler had, until that point, generally maintained a cautious but workable relationship with the neighboring kingdom of Jerusalem. The siege of Damascus in the summer of 1148 collapsed within days, a poorly planned and badly coordinated failure that achieved essentially nothing and, in an outcome bitterly ironic given the campaign's stated purpose, pushed Damascus's ruler directly into an alliance with Zengi's own son and successor, Nur ad-Din. Precisely the kind of unified Muslim opposition the fractured, mutually suspicious Crusader states had, until that point, generally managed to avoid facing all at once. Among the many participants in the Second Crusade, one deserves particular mention for the sheer scale of later legend that would grow up around her, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Queen consort of France through her marriage to Louis VII, accompanied her husband on the campaign along with a substantial retinue of her own vassal knights from Aquitaine, an active royal participation in a crusading campaign that few queens before or after would repeat in quite so visible a way. Later medieval and early modern legend embellished Eleanor's actual role considerably, including colorful and largely unsubstantiated stories about a scandalous relationship with her own uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, ruler of Antioch, during the Crusader army's stay in that city, claims modern historians treat with real skepticism given their late and politically motivated origins. Though the underlying marital tension between Eleanor and Louis during and after the campaign is well documented, and would, within a few years of their return to France, contribute to the annulment of their marriage, freeing Eleanor to marry the future King Henry II of England and become, through that second marriage, one of the most consequential royal women in the whole of medieval European history. Nur ad-Din, who inherited and steadily expanded his father Zengi's territory following Zengi's assassination in 1146, proved to be a far more capable, patient, and ideologically committed opponent of the Crusader states than his father had been. A ruler who combined genuine military skill with a deliberate and sustained campaign to frame resistance to the Crusaders in explicitly religious terms, promoting the concept of jihad as a unifying cause capable of drawing together the fractured and often mutually hostile Muslim territories of Syria and beyond. Over the following 2 decades, Nur ad-Din steadily extended his authority across Muslim Syria, eventually bringing Damascus itself under his direct control in 1154, and turned his attention toward Fatimid Egypt, a wealthy but politically unstable state whose internal court rivalries had made it a tempting target for both Nur-ad-Din and the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, each hoping to claim Egypt's substantial resources before the other could. It was during a series of military interventions in this Egyptian power struggle, sent by Nur-ad-Din in the 1160s under the command of a Kurdish general named Shirkuh, that a young officer serving under his uncle Shirkuh first began to distinguish himself, Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known to history by his honorific title, Salah ad-Din or Saladin. Following Shirkuh's death shortly after Egypt was finally secured in 1169, Saladin, still relatively young and initially regarded by many, including apparently Nur-ad-Din himself, as a somewhat unlikely or at least unproven choice, was appointed vizier of Fatimid Egypt, a position from which he moved, with a combination of political skill and evident personal ambition, to formally abolish the Fatimid Caliphate in 1171, restoring Egypt to nominal allegiance to the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and establishing himself as Egypt's effective independent ruler, governing in Nur-ad-Din's name but with an increasingly evident degree of personal autonomy that put a real and growing strain on his relationship with his own nominal overlord. Nur-ad-Din's death in 1174 removed the one figure whose authority Saladin had still, at least formally, continued to acknowledge, and Saladin moved with characteristic decisiveness to extend his own rule over Nur-ad-Din's former territories in Syria as well, a process that took most of the following decade and required Saladin to fight and diplomatically outmaneuver several rival claimants, including members of Nur-ad-Din's own family, before he had genuinely consolidated control over both Egypt and the bulk of Muslim Syria under his own single authority. By the mid-1180s, Saladin had achieved something no single Muslim ruler had managed in the nearly 90 years since the First Crusade's arrival, a genuinely unified power base surrounding the Crusader states on multiple sides at once, commanding resources and manpower the fractured, internally divided Kingdom of Jerusalem, itself increasingly weakened by its own succession disputes during this same period, had no comparable way to match. Saladin's rise rested on more than military conquest alone, and this account would be incomplete without noting the deliberate ideological and religious campaign he waged alongside his battlefield victories. Following Nur-ad-Din's own earlier lead, Saladin actively patronized the construction of religious colleges, or madrasas, across his territories, promoting a specifically Sunni religious revival in regions that had, under Fatimid rule, been governed for 2 centuries under Shia Islam, and cultivating a public image, through court chroniclers and religious scholars sympathetic to his cause, as the pious, divinely favored restorer of Sunni orthodoxy and the rightful champion of jihad against the Crusader states. This carefully cultivated reputation, whatever its more calculated political dimensions, does appear to have reflected genuine personal religious conviction on Saladin's part as well, according to the broad consensus of both contemporary chroniclers close to him and modern historians who have studied his surviving correspondence and recorded conduct. A combination of sincere piety and effective political self-presentation that would serve him extraordinarily well as he turned, in 1187, toward the campaign this account will now describe. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, in the years leading up to its greatest crisis, was led by a genuinely tragic figure, King Baldwin IV, crowned as a teenager in 1174 and afflicted with leprosy, a disease that progressively weakened him even as he demonstrated, in his healthier early years, real military and political competence, including a notable victory over Saladin's forces at the Battle of Magdasard in 1177. Baldwin's illness, and the succession crisis it inevitably created given that he could father no heir of his own, left the kingdom increasingly vulnerable to factional infighting among its nobility even as the external threat from Saladin's now unified territory grew steadily more serious. Raynald of Chatillon had, by this point, already spent decades establishing a reputation as one of the Crusader state's most reliably aggressive and diplomatically reckless lords. Captured and held prisoner in Aleppo for some 16 years following an earlier military disaster in the 1160s, Raynald emerged from his long captivity, according to most contemporary accounts, no more cautious than he had been before it, and went on to build a fortune and a following through a combination of advantageous marriage, brazen raiding, and a genuine talent for provoking exactly the kind of open conflict that more cautious Crusader nobles, wary of Saladin's growing power, actively tried to avoid. The immediate trigger for the catastrophe to come is generally attributed by most historians to this same Raynald of Chatillon, whose repeated raids on Muslim trade caravans and pilgrim routes, including one notorious raid on a rich caravan that later, less reliable tradition would claim carried a female relative of Saladin's own family. A specific detail modern historians treat with some caution given its uncertain sourcing, and at least one further, better documented attack that violated an existing truce between the kingdom and Saladin, gave Saladin both the pretext and the widespread support across his own territories needed to launch a full-scale invasion of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1187. The Crusader army that assembled to meet this invasion, led by King Guy of Lusignan, who had married into the royal family and taken the throne following Baldwin IV's death in 1185, made a decision that military historians have scrutinized and criticized ever since. Rather than remaining near a secure water source and forcing Saladin's forces to come to them, the Crusader army marched across dry, exposed terrain toward the besieged town of Tiberias, a decision reportedly urged strongly by Raynald and contested, according to several contemporary accounts, by other Crusader nobles who recognized the danger more clearly. The result, on the 4th of July, 1187, was a catastrophe from which the Kingdom of Jerusalem would never genuinely recover. Saladin's forces, having deliberately harassed and cut off the Crusader army's access to water during its exhausting march, encircled and decisively destroyed the Crusader force near a pair of hills known as the Horns of Hattin, in what remains one of the most consequential single battles in the entire history of the Crusades. Nearly the entire fighting strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was killed or captured in a single afternoon, including King Guy himself, taken prisoner along with a substantial portion of the kingdom's surviving nobility. Saladin, in the battle's immediate aftermath, treated his royal captive with recorded courtesy, reportedly offering Guy a cup of iced water with his own hands, but showed a very different face toward Raynald of Chatillon specifically, whom Saladin, citing Raynald's repeated truce violations and personal history of provocation, executed himself on the spot. A targeted act of retribution that most contemporary and modern historians alike treat as distinct in character from the broader, more restrained treatment Saladin extended to the rest of his captives that day. Among the losses that day, one carried a symbolic weight considerably beyond its immediate military significance, the relic Crusader tradition venerated as the True Cross, carried into battle at Hattin as it had been carried into most of the kingdom's major engagements for decades, was captured by Saladin's forces and never returned to Christian hands, an object whose loss contemporary Crusader sources mourn with an intensity that, in its own way, rivaled their grief over the human casualties of the battle itself. With the Kingdom of Jerusalem's field army effectively annihilated, the city of Jerusalem itself, and most of the kingdom's remaining territory, now lay almost entirely undefended. In the weeks following Hattin, Saladin moved methodically to capture the now largely undefended cities and fortresses of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, meeting little organized resistance from a kingdom whose military strength had been effectively destroyed in a single afternoon. By early October of 1187, Jerusalem itself, defended by a hastily organized garrison under Balian of Ibelin, one of the few senior nobles to have escaped Hattin, was all that meaningfully remained. Balian, according to several accounts, initially attempted to negotiate terms, and when Saladin's forces began actively besieging the city, reportedly threatened, in a moment of genuine desperation, to destroy the city's Islamic holy sites and kill the substantial Muslim prisoner population held within Jerusalem's walls before the city could be taken by force, a threat that, whatever its sincerity, appears to have influenced Saladin's willingness to negotiate a formal surrender rather than press for an unconditional, potentially far more destructive assault. The terms Saladin ultimately granted, and the manner in which Jerusalem's fall actually unfolded on the 2nd of October, 1187, stand in a contrast with the events of 1099 that contemporary chroniclers on both sides, and nearly every historian who has written about the period since, have found genuinely and deliberately striking. Rather than the extensive slaughter that had followed the First Crusade's capture of the city, Saladin permitted Jerusalem's Christian inhabitants to leave the city peacefully upon payment of a ransom, set at a level modern historians generally regard as relatively modest by the standards of the period, and, in numerous documented cases, personally funded the ransom payments of poorer residents who could not afford the fee themselves, out of his own treasury or through donations he actively solicited from wealthier Muslim nobles present. Saladin's brother, Aladil, reportedly requested and was granted a substantial number of captives to free without ransom at all, a gesture Saladin apparently extended to several other emirs present as well, considerably reducing the number of Christian residents who ultimately faced slavery or serious harm. Saladin's reconquest was also, quite deliberately, a religious restoration and not merely a political one. The great golden cross the Crusaders had placed atop the Dome of the Rock in 1099 was taken down, and the building itself, along with the nearby Al-Aqsa Mosque, which Crusader occupation had converted for use as a royal palace and, for a time, as headquarters for the Knights Templar, was ritually cleansed with rosewater brought specifically from Damascus for the purpose, before both were formally reconsecrated for Muslim worship. Saladin himself reportedly delivered the first Friday sermon at Al-Aqsa following its reconsecration, a moment contemporary Muslim chroniclers describe as the emotional culmination of the entire campaign, carrying a significance to the Muslim world roughly comparable to what the city's capture in 1099 had carried for Western Christendom 88 years earlier, two mirrored moments of religious triumph, separated by less than a century, each experienced by one side as liberation and by the other as catastrophe. This should not be romanticized into an uncomplicated portrait of pure magnanimity. A meaningful number of Christian residents who genuinely could not raise the ransom, despite Saladin's donations, were indeed enslaved, and the episode remains, even in its most favorable light, a conquest rather than any kind of neutral or bloodless transfer of power. But the historical record is nonetheless unambiguous that Saladin's conduct at Jerusalem in 1187 was deliberately, substantially more restrained than the Crusaders' own conduct at the same city 88 years earlier, a contrast Muslim chroniclers of the period noted with evident and understandable pride. and one that later historians across multiple traditions, including many Western ones, have consistently cited as a defining and largely uncontested feature of Saladin's historical reputation. News of Jerusalem's fall, when it reached Western Europe, triggered profound shock and, within roughly 2 years, the launch of a new crusade specifically aimed at reversing it, led, this time, by some of the most famous royal figures in the entire history of the crusading movement. The Third Crusade, launched in response to Jerusalem's fall, drew an unusually formidable roster of European monarchs into direct participation: Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, King Philip II of France, and King Richard I of England, the last of whom would become, in the centuries of legend and popular memory that followed, perhaps the single most famous crusader in the entire movement's history, remembered by the epithet Richard the Lionheart. Frederick Barbarossa, leading the largest of the 3 royal contingents overland through Anatolia, drowned crossing a river in June of 1190 before his forces ever reached the Holy Land, a loss that removed what many contemporaries regarded as the single most experienced and formidable military leader among the Crusade's royal participants, and one that considerably diminished the German contribution to the campaign that followed. Frederick, already in his late 60s and a veteran of decades of European warfare and an earlier, largely successful overland march through Byzantine and Seljuk territory during this very campaign, drowned attempting to cross the Salaf River in Cilicia. Accounts differ on whether he was thrown from his horse, suffered a heart attack while swimming, or simply misjudged the river's current. But the practical result was the same regardless: much of his grief-stricken army, lacking the resources to properly preserve his body for the remainder of the journey, dispersed or turned back entirely, and only a fraction of the originally formidable German contingent ultimately reached the Holy Land at all. The long siege of Acre that both kings eventually joined had, for most of its nearly 2-year duration before their arrival, been sustained largely by naval power rather than by any single dominant land army. Pisan and Genoese fleets, along with vessels from the remaining Crusader states themselves, maintained a blockade that kept the besieged Muslim garrison cut off from reliable resupply by sea. Though determined Muslim blockade runners, sailing small, fast vessels disguised with captured Crusader flags and equipment, did periodically slip through with supplies and reinforcements throughout the siege, a cat-and-mouse contest at sea that ran alongside the more famous fighting on land for the entire length of the siege, even as a relieving Ayyubid army under Saladin's own command simultaneously besieged the besiegers from the landward side, producing the genuinely unusual spectacle of 3 armies effectively surrounding one another in concentric rings for years on end without any single side managing a decisive breakthrough. Richard's own arrival brought a further naval dimension to the campaign. En route to the Holy Land, his fleet captured Cyprus from its Byzantine governor after a dispute escalated into open conflict, an acquisition Richard had not originally planned but which he treated with characteristic decisiveness, selling the island in turn to the Templars and then, when that arrangement quickly proved unworkable, to Guy of Lusignan, the deposed king of Jerusalem, establishing a new Lusignan dynasty on Cyprus that would go on to outlast every mainland Crusader state by more than a century and a half. Richard and Philip, traveling separately by sea, both eventually arrived to join the protracted siege of Acre, a coastal city that Crusader and allied forces had already been besieging for roughly 2 years by the time the 2 kings finally arrived in 1191, and whose eventual fall to the combined Crusader forces that summer marked the campaign's first major success. The relationship between Richard and Philip, however, deteriorated steadily throughout the siege and its aftermath, worn down by personal rivalry, disputes over the distribution of captured territory and spoils, and Philip's own declining health and evident eagerness to return to pressing political concerns back in France. Tensions that culminated in Philip's departure for home shortly after Acre's capture, leaving Richard as the Crusade's sole remaining royal commander, a position that let the English king dominate the campaign's later stages and, non-incidentally, its subsequent popular legend. In a way, the actual military balance of contributions among the various Crusader nations does not entirely justify Richard's own conduct following Acre's surrender, however, complicates any straightforwardly heroic account of his campaign, and this account will state it directly rather than passing over it. When negotiations over the terms of the garrison's surrender, including the release of Christian prisoners and payment of an agreed ransom, stalled and dragged on longer than Richard was willing to tolerate, he ordered the execution of an estimated 2,700 Muslim prisoners from the Acre garrison outside the city's walls in August of 1191, an act contemporary Muslim chroniclers, and a number of Christian ones as well, recorded with evident shock, and one modern historians generally treat as a severe violation of the customary conventions of siege surrender even by the harsh standards of medieval warfare. Saladin's own subsequent treatment of Christian captives, while not without its own harsh moments across the broader conflict, never approached a killing of comparable scale in a single, deliberate act. A contrast worth holding alongside the more flattering popular memory of Richard the Lionheart that later English and European tradition would go on to build. Richard's subsequent campaign showed genuine tactical skill, most notably at the Battle of Arsuf in September of 1191, where Crusader forces under Richard's direct command decisively defeated Saladin's army in one of the few large open-field battles of the entire Third Crusade, employing careful discipline to resist Saladin's harassing cavalry tactics until the moment was right for a coordinated counterattack. Despite this and other successes, Richard, after two separate advances toward Jerusalem itself, concluded on both occasions that his forces lacked the numbers and secure supply lines needed to actually besiege and hold the city even if he managed to capture it, a sober, strategically defensible assessment that nonetheless left the Crusade's core religious objective, the recapture of Jerusalem, ultimately unachieved. What Richard's campaign did produce, instead, was an extended period of negotiation with Saladin himself, conducted with a degree of mutual respect that became, and later retelling on both the Christian and Muslim sides, nearly as celebrated as anything that happened on the actual battlefield. The negotiations between Richard and Saladin, conducted over many months through intermediaries and occasional more direct contact, including reportedly through Saladin's brother Aladil, produced a formal agreement in September of 1192 known as the Treaty of Jaffa. Under its terms, Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims were guaranteed safe access to the city's holy sites, and the Crusader states retained a substantially reduced but still meaningful strip of coastal territory, running roughly from Tyre south to Jaffa, that would allow the Kingdom of Jerusalem to continue existing, in a considerably diminished form, for another century. Neither side, by most contemporary accounts, regarded the treaty as a fully satisfying outcome. Richard had failed to recapture Jerusalem itself, the Crusade's stated central objective, while Saladin had been forced to formally concede continued Christian access to a city he had fought hard to reclaim only 5 years earlier, but the agreement did achieve a genuine and, for the war-weary populations on both sides, badly needed reduction in active hostilities. Richard departed the Holy Land in October of 1192, beginning a return journey to Europe that would itself become the stuff of considerable legend and genuine misfortune. Shipwrecked, forced to travel overland in disguise through hostile territory, and ultimately captured and held for ransom by Duke Leopold of Austria, whom Richard had personally offended during the siege of Acre, before being handed over to Emperor Henry VI and held for well over a year until an enormous ransom, reportedly requiring a special tax levied across England to raise, finally secured his release in early 1194. Saladin, for his part, did not long outlive the peace he had negotiated. He died in Damascus in March of 1193, only months after the Treaty of Jaffa was concluded, from an illness that came on relatively suddenly during the winter following the agreement. Saladin's death was met, even among many of his former Crusader adversaries, with expressions of genuine and evidently sincere respect. Contemporary Christian chroniclers, despite representing the very civilization Saladin had fought against for nearly 2 decades, frequently described him in terms of admiration for his personal conduct, his generosity, and his sense of honor, a reputation that would only grow more elaborate and more romanticized in later centuries of European literature, eventually transforming Saladin, somewhat ironically, into one of the most consistently admired figures in the entire Western literary tradition of Crusader-era storytelling. The Third Crusade, whatever its strategic disappointments, had at least secured the Kingdom of Jerusalem's continued survival along a narrow coastal strip, a survival that would prove precarious, contested, and increasingly disconnected from the movement's original religious objectives, as the crusading impulse itself, and the campaign still to come, began drifting toward targets its original architects could scarcely have imagined or, in at least one case, would likely have been horrified by. Pope Innocent III, elected in 1198, proved to be one of the most energetic and ambitious popes of the entire medieval period, and among his earliest major initiatives was a call for a new crusade, the fourth in the sequence this account has followed, aimed once again at recovering Jerusalem, this time through a planned naval invasion of Egypt, whose wealth and strategic position Crusader strategists had increasingly come to regard as the real key to any lasting recovery of the Holy Land. The Crusader leadership that assembled in response to Innocent's call negotiated a substantial transport contract with the Republic of Venice, agreeing to pay the Maritime Republic a considerable sum in exchange for ships and supplies sufficient to carry the entire Crusader army across the Mediterranean to Egypt. The crusade, however, ran into a serious and, as it turned out, fateful problem almost immediately. The number of Crusaders who actually arrived at Venice to begin the journey fell substantially short of the numbers originally projected, leaving the assembled force unable to raise the full payment it had contractually promised the Venetians for the fleet already built and waiting. Enrico Dandolo, the elderly but politically formidable Doge of Venice, proposed a solution that would redirect the entire Crusade's purpose in a way its original organizers had never intended. In exchange for deferring the outstanding debt, the Crusader army would first assist Venice in capturing the city of Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic coast that had rebelled against Venetian control and placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary, himself a Catholic monarch who had, notably, taken his own crusading vow. Despite direct papal objections and Innocent III's explicit prohibition against attacking a fellow Christian city, the Crusader army, dependent on Venetian ships and facing few realistic alternatives, participated in the siege and capture of Zara in November of 1202, an act for which Innocent III excommunicated the entire expedition, Venetians and Crusaders alike, though he would later, with evident reluctance and considerable political calculation, lift the excommunication specifically for the Crusaders while maintaining it against Venice. With the Crusades' original momentum and moral standing already badly compromised by the attack on Zara, an even more consequential diversion soon presented itself. A Byzantine claimant to the imperial throne, a young prince named Alexios Angelos, approached the Crusader leadership with an offer if the Crusaders would help him depose the reigning Byzantine emperor, his own uncle, and place him on the throne instead. He would reward them with enormous sums of money, provisions, and military support for the continued campaign against Egypt, an offer that proved, to the considerable and lasting misfortune of both the Crusade and the Byzantine Empire, extremely difficult for the debt-burdened, increasingly opportunistic Crusader leadership to refuse. The Crusader fleet, diverted a second time, arrived before Constantinople in the summer of 1203 and, after an initial successful assault, restored Alexios Angelos to the Byzantine throne alongside his father, the previously deposed Emperor Isaac II, an arrangement that immediately proved unstable since the new co-emperors, now dependent on the very Crusader army camped outside their capital, struggled to raise the enormous payments they had promised in exchange for military support, straining an already resentful relationship between the Crusaders and the Byzantine population inside the city's walls. A separate historical account of this same city's much later fall, in 1453, and the very different circumstances surrounding it, is told in full elsewhere on this channel. What happened here, in 1204, was a different kind of catastrophe entirely, brought about not by an external conqueror but by an army that had originally set out, at least in name, as the city's ally. Growing popular unrest inside Constantinople, fueled by resentment of both the financial burden and the presence of a foreign army, led to a palace coup in early 1204 that overthrew and executed young Alexios, installing a new emperor, Alexios V, who took an immediately hostile stance toward the Crusader camp outside the walls and refused to honor his predecessor's financial obligations at all. With their promised payment now entirely unrecoverable through negotiation, and facing genuine practical desperation after years of debt and diverted campaigning that had already carried them thousands of miles from their original objective in Egypt, the Crusader leadership and their Venetian partners made the decision to take the city by force instead, not to restore any claimant to the throne this time, but for outright conquest and plunder. Constantinople fell to Crusader assault in April of 1204, and the sack that followed stands, by the assessment of most historians across multiple traditions including many Western Christian ones, among the most destructive events in the entire history of a city that had survived siege after siege across nearly 9 centuries without ever previously being captured by a hostile force. Crusader and Venetian forces looted the city's churches, palaces, and private homes with an intensity contemporary Byzantine chroniclers, including the eyewitness historian Nicetas Choniates, described with genuine horror, recording the destruction and theft of religious relics, artworks, and treasures accumulated across centuries of Byzantine imperial history, a substantial portion of which was carried back to Western Europe and never returned, including the famous bronze horses later installed atop St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, along with countless illuminated manuscripts, gilded reliquaries, and enameled icons scattered across cathedral treasuries throughout France, Italy, and the Low Countries, several of which modern museum curators and art historians are still, centuries later, in the ongoing process of tracing back to their original Byzantine origins. The Hagia Sophia itself, the great cathedral church that had stood as Byzantine Christianity's most sacred and symbolically important building for nearly 700 years, was ransacked alongside the rest of the city. Nicetas Coniates records looters stripping its silver fixtures, smashing its altar for its precious materials, and, in a detail that later Byzantine memory would return to again and again with particular bitterness, reportedly seating a prostitute on the cathedral's patriarchal throne amid the general desecration, an image that crystallized, for Byzantine writers in the centuries that followed, the full moral inversion of a supposedly holy war turned against a fellow Christian people's most sacred space. Pope Innocent III himself, upon learning the full details of what had happened to a fellow Christian capital under the banner of his own crusade, wrote in evident dismay and genuine anger at the army he had originally called into being, condemning the sack in terms that later historians have generally treated as a sincere, if belated, papal repudiation of an outcome the Crusades' original organizers had never remotely intended. In the wake of Constantinople's conquest, the victorious Crusaders divided much of the Byzantine Empire's former territory among themselves, establishing a new state called the Latin Empire of Constantinople, with a Flemish nobleman, Baldwin of Flanders, elected as its first Latin emperor. An arrangement that replaced nearly 9 centuries of continuous Byzantine imperial rule with a fragile, foreign-imposed regime that never came close to commanding the loyalty or administrative depth of the empire it had displaced. Several Byzantine successor states, most significantly the Empire of Nicaea across the Bosphorus and Anatolia, continued to claim legitimate Byzantine imperial authority throughout the Latin Empire's existence, preserving Byzantine institutions, culture, and religious identity in exile and functioning, for the following half-century, as the genuine continuation of Byzantine political tradition in every meaningful sense except physical possession of the capital itself. The Latin Empire, chronically short of resources, facing hostility from the surrounding Byzantine successor states and from Bulgaria, whose own forces inflicted a severe defeat on Latin Emperor Baldwin himself at the Battle of Adrianople in 1205, capturing and, according to most accounts, executing him within little more than a year of his coronation, and never able to establish anything resembling secure or effective governance over its fragmented territory, survived for only 57 years. Before Byzantine forces from the Empire of Nicaea, under Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos, recaptured Constantinople in 1261, restoring Byzantine rule to the city. Though the restored empire that emerged from this reconquest was, in territory, wealth, and military capacity, a considerably diminished shadow of what Byzantium had been before 1204. Modern historians treat the Fourth Crusade sack of Constantinople as one of the most consequential single events in the Byzantine Empire's long decline, weakening the empire so severely and so permanently that many historians consider it to have never genuinely recovered, a structural vulnerability that would contribute directly to the empire's final, much later fall to Ottoman forces in 1453, the very different and separately documented story this channel has already told in full elsewhere. For the broader crusading movement, the Fourth Crusade's fate cast a long and complicated shadow. It demonstrated, with an undeniable clarity that later crusade organizers could not simply ignore, how thoroughly a campaign launched with genuine religious purpose could be redirected by debt, opportunism, and the practical logistics of medieval warfare toward outcomes its original architects had never intended and, in Innocent III's own case, came to bitterly regret. The event also permanently deepened the schism between the Latin Catholic and Greek Orthodox churches, adding a concrete, still remembered historical grievance to a theological division that had already existed since 1054. a legacy of mutual distrust between Western and Eastern Christianity that outlasted the crusading movement itself by many centuries and that some historians and religious leaders describe as not fully healed, even in more recent times. In 1212, a genuinely strange and still historically murky episode occurred, popularly remembered as the Children's Crusade, though modern historians treat this label, and much of the popular legend surrounding the event, with considerable and well-justified caution. Contemporary chronicles describe bands of young people in France and separately in Germany, inspired by charismatic preachers to set out on their own unauthorized pilgrimage toward the Holy Land, apparently believing, according to the most repeated versions of the story, that their innocence and faith alone would succeed where armed crusader campaigns had failed. Modern historical research has substantially revised this popular account, suggesting that many, and quite possibly most, of the participants were not literal children at all but rather young, poor, and landless adults and adolescents, whose crusade appears to have been considerably smaller in scale, and to have ended in ways considerably less dramatic and less exotic than the enduring popular legend, which includes vivid but poorly sourced later claims that many participants were sold into slavery after being lured onto ships at Marseille, would suggest. What is better documented, and considerably more consequential for the actual Crusader states in the Levant, is the steady institutional and territorial decline that continued through the early decades of the 13th century. Pope Innocent III called for yet another crusade shortly before his death in 1216, which developed into what historians number as the Fifth Crusade, and subsequent decades saw a continuing pattern this account will now describe more quickly than the earlier campaigns. Waves of crusading effort launched from Europe, achieving intermittent, usually temporary success, while the underlying demographic and military balance in the Levant continued shifting steadily against the Crusader states' long-term survival. The Crusader states, never able to draw on population reserves remotely comparable to their Muslim neighbors, remained permanently dependent on periodic waves of reinforcement and financial support from Western Europe, support that grew progressively less reliable and less generous as the 13th century wore on and as European royal and papal attention increasingly turned toward other, closer political priorities. Part of that shifting attention deserves to be noted directly, since it complicates any assumption that crusade always meant a campaign toward Jerusalem specifically, was the Church's growing willingness to direct crusading energy, complete with the same vows, indulgences, and formal papal sanction, toward targets much closer to home and considerably more religiously ambiguous than a Muslim-held Holy Land. Beginning in 1209, Pope Innocent III called a crusade against the Cathars, a Christian dualist religious movement the Church regarded as a dangerous heresy, concentrated in the Languedoc region of southern France, a campaign, remembered as the Albigensian Crusade, that saw Crusader armies granted the same spiritual rewards as those marching to the Levant, wage a brutal two-decade war against fellow Christians and the southern French nobility that had tolerated or protected them. The Albigensian Crusade, along with several other later political crusades the papacy would authorize against various Christian rivals in the 13th century, illustrates how thoroughly the crusading concept had, within little more than a century of Urban's original call, expanded well beyond its founding purpose of recovering Jerusalem, becoming instead a flexible papal tool for waging holy war against a considerably wider range of targets than the movement's origin story alone would suggest. The Fifth Crusade, launched in 1217 and continuing through 1221, pursued a strategy that would recur repeatedly across the crusading movement's later history. Rather than attacking the Holy Land directly, the Crusader army targeted Egypt, correctly recognizing that Muslim political and military power in the region was now centered there rather than in Syria or Palestine, and that controlling Egypt might offer a more durable path to recovering and holding Jerusalem than direct assault ever had. The campaign achieved a genuine initial success, capturing the strategically important port city of Damietta in 1221 after a lengthy siege, but ultimately collapsed when the Crusader army, advancing further into Egypt against the advice of some of its own more cautious commanders, found itself trapped by rising Nile floodwaters deliberately released by the defending Ayyubid forces, forcing a humiliating surrender and the return of Damietta itself in exchange for the army's safe withdrawal. The Sixth Crusade, which followed roughly a decade later, stands as one of the genuinely strangest episodes in the entire crusading movement's history. A campaign that recovered Jerusalem not through battle but through negotiated diplomacy, led by a Holy Roman Emperor who had actually been excommunicated by the Pope at the very moment he set out. Frederick II, a famously unconventional monarch fluent in Arabic and genuinely, by the standards of his era, deeply curious about and respectful of Islamic culture and scholarship, arrived in the Holy Land in 1228 and, rather than pursuing military conquest, opened direct negotiations with the Ayyubid Sultan Al-Kamil, Saladin's nephew, who faced his own pressing political concerns elsewhere in his territory and had genuine incentive to reach an accommodation with the Crusaders rather than fight. Another costly war. The resulting treaty, concluded in February of 1229, returned Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Crusader control along with a protected corridor connecting them to the coast, while explicitly preserving Muslim control over the Temple Mount's holy sites and guaranteeing continued Muslim access to them, an outcome that recovered Jerusalem for Christian rule for the first time since Saladin's reconquest more than 4 decades earlier, achieved entirely without a major battle, and that was met, remarkably, with considerable hostility and suspicion from both the Pope, still formally at odds with the excommunicated emperor who had achieved it, and from a substantial portion of the Crusader nobility in the Levant itself, who regarded a negotiated peace with a Muslim ruler as a poor and dishonorable substitute for the military victory the crusading movement's rhetoric had always promised. Jerusalem's Second Crusader period, secured through Frederick II's negotiated treaty, proved considerably shorter-lived than the first. In 1244, the city was captured, this time not by a major Ayyubid campaign but by a marauding force of Khwarezmian Turks, themselves refugees displaced westward by the Mongol conquests then reshaping Central Asia, who had been hired as mercenaries by the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt and who sacked Jerusalem with a severity that shocked even contemporaries already well accustomed to the region's long history of conquest and reconquest. This loss, permanent as it turned out, Jerusalem would not return to any form of Christian political control again during the medieval crusading period, prompted King Louis IX of France, a monarch remembered, including eventually through formal Catholic canonization, for genuine and by most accounts sincere personal piety, to organize and personally lead what historians number as the Seventh Crusade. Louis's campaign, launched in 1248, followed the by now familiar strategic logic of targeting Egypt first, and achieved an early success capturing Damietta in 1249, the same city the Fifth Crusade had briefly held decades earlier, before advancing toward Cairo in a campaign that ultimately met a fate strikingly similar to its predecessors. Louis's forces were defeated at the Battle of Al-Mansura in early 1250, and Louis himself, along with a substantial portion of his surviving army, was captured by Ayyubid forces, An extraordinary and deeply humiliating outcome for the crusading movement given Louis's status as a reigning king of France personally leading the campaign. Louis was eventually released after payment of an enormous ransom and the negotiated return of Damietta, and rather than returning immediately to France, chose to spend several additional years in the Crusader states, working to improve their fortifications and political organization before finally sailing home in 1254. A personal commitment to the crusading cause that, combined with his eventual canonization as a saint, cemented Louis's reputation as one of the most sincerely devoted crusader monarchs in the movement's entire history, whatever the practical military failures of his actual campaign. Louis's devotion to the crusading cause proved, in the end, fatal rather than merely disappointing. In 1270, 16 years after returning from his first campaign, Louis organized and personally led an 8th numbered crusade, this time directing the expedition not toward Egypt or the Levant at all but toward Tunis, in North Africa, apparently believing, on advice whose reliability modern historians view with some skepticism, that the Tunisian ruler might be persuaded to convert to Christianity and that the resulting alliance would strengthen the broader crusading position in the Mediterranean. The campaign never seriously engaged its intended target. Disease swept through the Crusader camp almost immediately after landing, and Louis himself died of illness outside Tunis in August of 1270, bringing his own reign and his lifelong crusading ambitions to an abrupt end without a single major battle having been fought, and effectively marking the end of any further large-scale royal crusading expedition from Western Europe of the kind that had defined the movement since 1095. Even as these later crusades unfolded, a far more consequential shift in regional power was already taking shape within Egypt itself. The Ayyubid dynasty that Saladin had founded increasingly relied, as many medieval Islamic states did, on a professional military caste of slave soldiers known as Mamluks, typically Turkic or Circassian in origin, purchased or captured as children, converted to Islam, and trained from a young age in a rigorous military and religious education that produced some of the most formidable soldiers in the entire medieval Islamic world. In 1250, in the direct aftermath of the very campaign against Louis IX described in the previous chapter, Mamluk officers overthrew the last effective Ayyubid Sultan and established their own independent Mamluk Sultanate, ruling Egypt and, over the following decades, the bulk of Muslim Syria as well, a dynasty that would prove to be, by a considerable margin, the most militarily formidable and consistently hostile opponent the Crusader states had faced across the entire two-century span of their existence. The Mamluk system itself, unusual enough to warrant a moment's direct explanation, was not a hereditary aristocracy in the conventional European sense at all. A Mamluk's own sons were generally excluded from inheriting their father's military status, and each new generation of the ruling elite was instead replenished through the continued purchase and training of new slave soldiers from the same Central Asian and Caucasian regions, producing a genuinely unusual political structure in which supreme political power in Egypt and Syria was held, generation after generation, not by hereditary bloodlines but by a continuously self-renewing military caste that had, by definition, no ruling family dynasty in the way Western European or even most other Islamic monarchies of the period would have recognized. This structure, whatever its oddities by comparative standards, produced a genuinely formidable and remarkably durable state. The Mamluk Sultanate that emerged from this system would go on to rule Egypt and Syria for more than 2.5 centuries after the Crusader states themselves had ceased to exist, eventually falling only to Ottoman conquest in 1517. The Mamluk Sultanate's early decades were shaped decisively by an external threat considerably more alarming to the entire region than the Crusader states had ever posed: the westward advance of the Mongol Empire, which had already devastated much of Central Asia, Persia, and Mesopotamia, sacking Baghdad itself in 1258 and ending the 5th-century Abbasid Caliphate's political presence there in one of the most catastrophic single events in medieval Islamic history. It was Mamluk forces, under the command of the general Baibars, who halted the seemingly unstoppable Mongol advance at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine in 1260. A battle whose significance extended well beyond the immediate military outcome, since it marked the first major defeat the Mongol Empire had suffered in its westward expansion and established the Mamluks as the region's dominant military power, with consequences that would fall, in the following decades, directly and repeatedly on the greatly weakened remnants of the Crusader states. Baibars, who became Mamluk Sultan himself in 1260 following the assassination of his predecessor, pursued a sustained and highly effective campaign against the Crusader states throughout the following decade, capturing city after city and fortress after fortress with a level of military organization and siege capability the Crusader states, chronically short on manpower and increasingly reliant on divided, often mutually antagonistic factions of European settlers and short-term reinforcements. From a Europe growing steadily less interested in the crusading project, simply could not match. Antioch itself, the second Crusader state ever founded and one of the movement's original and most prestigious conquests, fell to Baibars' forces in 1268. Its capture accompanied by a massacre and enslavement of the city's population that contemporary accounts describe in terms nearly as severe as the events of Jerusalem in 1099, a grim, symmetrical bookend to a conflict that had, across nearly 2 centuries, produced comparable atrocities on more than one side, at more than one moment. This account has tried to describe with equal honesty regardless of which side committed them. By the final decades of the 13th century, the once substantial network of Crusader territory had been reduced to a scattering of coastal cities, most prominently Acre, which had served as the effective capital and primary remaining stronghold of the Kingdom of Jerusalem since the loss of the city of Jerusalem itself decades earlier. The Mamluk sultans who followed Baibars, first Kalawan, and then Kalawan's son Al-Ashraf Khalil, continued the systematic campaign of conquest their predecessor had begun, steadily reducing the Crusader states' remaining coastal holdings one by one, while European support for the crusading project, worn down by more than a century of expensive campaigns yielding increasingly modest and increasingly temporary results, continued its long decline into something closer to indifference. Acre itself came under sustained Mamluk siege beginning in April of 1291, defended by a garrison substantially outnumbered by the besieging Mamluk force and reinforced, in its final weeks, only by scattered and militarily insufficient contingents that arrived far too late and in far too small numbers to meaningfully alter the campaign's outcome. The city's walls were breached in mid-May, and the fighting that followed inside Acre proved brutal and largely uncontrolled, echoing, on a considerably smaller scale, the pattern of urban conquest and its human cost that this account has now described at Jerusalem twice, at Antioch, and at Constantinople across the preceding chapters. A substantial portion of the city's population killed or enslaved in the chaos following the breach, a final and bitter piece of the same broader pattern of medieval siege warfare's characteristic brutality that had marked the movements beginning nearly 2 centuries earlier at exactly this same eastern Mediterranean coastline. Among those who did escape the final chaos, a group of Templar knights reportedly held out for several additional days inside their fortified compound within the city, continuing to shelter civilian refugees even after the rest of Acre had fallen, before the compound itself finally collapsed, by most accounts undermined by Mamluk sappers, killing defenders and refugees alike in the collapse, a small, largely forgotten final act of resistance that later Templar tradition would remember as a fittingly grim final stand for an order founded nearly 2 centuries earlier and in this very city's general region for the specific purpose of protecting Christian pilgrims and travelers in the Holy Land. With Acre's fall on the 18th of May, 1291, the Kingdom of Jerusalem's last meaningful territory in the Levant was gone. The few remaining, smaller Crusader outposts along the coast were evacuated or fell in the weeks and months that immediately followed, and by the end of that same summer, nearly 2 centuries after Godfrey of Bouillon's forces had first breached Jerusalem's walls in 1099, no organized Crusader state remained anywhere on the Levantine mainland. The military orders that had defended the Crusader states for so long, the Templars and Hospitallers most prominently among them, relocated their remaining forces and resources to Cyprus and, in the Hospitallers' case, would eventually establish new bases first on Rhodes and later on Malta, continuing a modified, considerably reduced form of military and religious mission for centuries afterward, even as the specific project that had originally created them, the defense of a Christian-ruled Jerusalem and its surrounding Crusader territories had now, definitively and permanently, come to an end. Consider, for a moment, everything this account has followed across nearly 200 years, a pope's appeal for modest military assistance that grew, almost by accident, into a mass movement he could never fully control, armies of common people destroyed before they ever reached the enemy they had set out to fight, a city taken with brutal violence in 1099 and then, 88 years later, retaken by a sultan whose restraint and victory became legendary on both sides of the very conflict he had just won. One thread runs through nearly every single chapter of this account, more consistently than any king, sultan, or single battle. Disease and starvation killed more Crusaders, on balance, than any opposing army ever did. It thinned the ranks outside Antioch before a single sword was drawn in anger there. It drove desperate men to eat the dead at Mara. It scattered the largest and best led of the Third Crusade's 3 royal armies before Frederick Barbarossa's body had even been properly buried. It took Saladin himself within a year of the peace he had fought so hard to secure, and it finally took Louis IX, a king who had already survived captivity, ransom, and outright military catastrophe once before, on a beach outside Tunis on a crusade that never came close to reaching a single battlefield. Any honest account of holy war in this period has to reckon with an uncomfortable truth that the more dramatic battle narratives can obscure, for the ordinary participant on either side, marching for months or years through unfamiliar terrain with medieval medicine and medieval logistics, the greatest enemy was very often not the opposing faith at all, but simply the road itself. A dead ode to Venetian shipbuilders that somehow ended with the sack of the wrong city entirely, a Christian capital nearly 9 centuries old, weakened so severely by its own supposed allies that it never fully recovered before a very different conqueror finally ended it, centuries later, in a story this channel has told separately and in full. The military and political legacy of the Crusades proved considerably more limited and more temporary than their scale and duration might suggest. Every Crusader state this account has described was eventually lost, every territorial gain in the Levant was eventually reversed, and the movement's core stated objective, a permanently secure Christian Jerusalem, was never durably achieved across the entire 2 centuries the crusading project actually lasted. What proved more lasting, and considerably more complicated to summarize than any single battle or treaty, was the pattern of cultural and economic contact the Crusades set in motion almost as a byproduct of their military failures: increased trade between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, the transmission of scientific, medical, and philosophical knowledge that had been preserved and substantially advanced within the Islamic world back into a Western Europe that had, in many of these fields, fallen genuinely behind, and the continued institutional legacy of the military orders, which long outlasted the specific territories they had originally been created to defend. That institutional legacy, in the Templars' particular case, ended not on any battlefield in the Levant but in a French royal court more than 15 years after Acre's fall. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, deeply indebted to the Templar order and evidently covetous of its substantial accumulated wealth, orchestrated the mass arrest of Templars across France on charges of heresy and blasphemy that modern historians overwhelmingly regard as fabricated, extracted through torture, and politically motivated rather than reflecting any genuine wrongdoing by the order. Pope Clement V, under sustained pressure from Philip, formally dissolved the Knights Templar in 1312, and the order's last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris in 1314. A genuinely grim final chapter for an institution originally founded, 2 centuries earlier, to protect unarmed pilgrims on the roads to Jerusalem, and one that later folklore and, in more recent centuries, an entire genre of popular conspiracy fiction would transform into one of the most persistently mythologized institutions to emerge from the whole of the crusading era. It is also worth a final pause, before this account closes, to consider the word crusade itself, a term this entire account has used freely throughout, but one that the participants themselves would not actually have recognized. Contemporaries of the First Crusade described what they were doing using terms like pilgrimage, the way of God, or simply the expedition. The word crusade, derived from the Latin for cross-bearing this account described several chapters ago, did not emerge as the standard term for the entire movement, retrospectively applied across all its component campaigns, until historians writing in later centuries began using it to describe a phenomenon they could now see, with the benefit of hindsight, as a single connected historical era in a way its own participants, focused on their own individual campaigns and immediate circumstances, generally could not. How the Crusades are remembered, this account should note directly in closing, has never been especially consistent across the different communities whose histories they shaped. In much of the modern Western historical tradition, the Crusades are increasingly presented, as this account has tried to present them, as a genuinely complicated mixture of religious conviction, political opportunism, and recurring atrocity committed by multiple sides rather than any single one. A marked shift from centuries of earlier European tradition that had often romanticized the Crusader knights as straightforwardly heroic figures. In much of the modern Middle East, by contrast, the Crusades are frequently remembered as a formative and still resonant historical experience of external invasion, one that some political and religious movements in more recent history have invoked, sometimes accurately and sometimes with considerable historical distortion, as a lens for understanding subsequent conflicts with the West. A use of this history this account will not itself extend any further into, since what happened after the medieval period ended belongs to more recent history, and to other tellers, rather than to the account you have just heard. What this account can say, with confidence, is only this: 200 years of war, launched in the name of faith, left behind no permanent kingdom, no lasting military victory for either side that endured. Only a long, unfinished argument about memory, faith, and violence that neither the Crusaders nor the people whose homeland they invaded ever fully resolved, and that, in various forms, the world has continued arguing about, on and off, ever since. Perhaps the fairest way to close this account, after everything you have just heard, is to resist the temptation either story tradition offers, the old Western romance of noble knights on a heroic quest, or an equally simple inversion casting every crusader as nothing more than an invader and every act of resistance to them as uncomplicated virtue. The people who lived through these 2 centuries, on every side of every siege this account has described, were not characters in either kind of story. There were soldiers who ate the dead rather than starve outside Antioch, queens who governed kingdoms their own sons tried to take from them, sultans who wept, by some accounts, at news of a beloved son's death in the same week they accepted a city surrender, and ordinary pilgrims who simply wanted, after weeks or months of hard road, to see a particular hill in a particular city before they died. That is a harder story to tell than good against evil. It is also, this account hopes you now agree, a considerably truer one. Rest now. The long argument can wait until tomorrow.